Thank you all for coming. I'd like to introduce Alice Horowitz. She's the chair of the SDC Eldridge Committee for the Glen Ellen Forum.
Thank you, Leslie. Wow, look at this. This is so great. Thank you all for coming out. It's really wonderful. Okay. So I am going to start by explaining this hybrid name that we have for our committee, which is SDC/Eldridge. So the SDC part of that, obviously being the Sonoma Developmental Center, and the Eldridge part of it being the property that's located in unincorporated county of Sonoma that is known as Eldridge. So it was Eldridge before the Sonoma Developmental Center was there, and it is Eldridge after the center closes. So the purpose of our committee is twofold. One is to keep the forum abreast of happenings with the SDC, and we are also tasked with taking a proactive stance regarding voicing the concerns and protecting the best interests of the people who live and work in Glen Ellen and Eldridge as the transition of the Eldridge property into something new occurs. And seeing that it's been several years since the last community-wide meeting on the SDC, and seeing that the SDC is scheduled to close very soon, now is the time to gather community input if we are to have a say in what happens with the Eldridge property. So thank you so very much for coming out, and thank you also to the Land Trust and the Ecology Center and the Glen Ellen Historical Society, with whom we've worked very hard to put this meeting together. So before we proceed, I want to be clear about two really important things. One is that we are here to talk about the future of the Eldridge property and not the SDC as a hospital and its closure, nor about what is the future of the last residents that are living there. Those are decisions that were made at the state level, and our hearts really go out to everyone whose life has been disrupted by the closure. But we are here to talk specifically about the future of the property. And also, our committee does not speak for the County of Sonoma, nor do we speak for the SDC Coalition, which is chaired by Supervisor Susan Gorin. She has another really important meeting tonight, but she hopes to be able to attend a little later on. However, our committee, and by extension the Glen Ellen Forum, now has a seat at the table with the leadership of the SDC Coalition. And this is a really important development for our town, and it's a very, very recent development, so that's a big deal. And in the spirit of collaboration with others working on the transition of the Eldridge property, what we are trying to do here tonight is to share information and build consensus so that after the last residents of the hospital are moved into group homes, we are in a position to speak directly for those who are most directly affected by the changes that are going to occur. Specifically, the Glen Ellen Eldridge community and the wildlife, the trees, the watershed, and the vistas. So lastly, to prime ourselves for envisioning a future for the Eldridge property that fits with our community, and that would be a future that takes into, it recognizes the fact that the property sits right in the middle of a wildlife corridor. And that would be a future that recognizes the limits of our local infrastructure. That would be a future that enhances the greater Glen Ellen and Sonoma Valley community. I want to ask you to please take just a moment to reflect on your own personal connection to the property. You know, some of you in our Native American community, your ancestors, the first stewards of these lands, lived there. Some of you have disabled loved ones who lived in the hospital perhaps for decades. Some of you worked at the hospital for decades. Some of you played ball on the fields, or you learned to drive on the roads back by the junior farm, or maybe you taught your own kids to drive back there. Many of you hike its hills on a daily basis looking for peace and quiet in its meadows and finding inspiration in its beauty. So as we, and all of us, as we move through the floor of the valley on the SDC campus, we can all appreciate the unobstructed views of the beautiful hills, and we can mark the seasons and the changing colors of those magnificent trees that line Arnold Drive. And we can all see the old admin building that its crumbling walls once held the promise of new beginnings. So please take a moment just to feel in yourself what your own connection is to the property. And as we move through the different stages of this workshop, think about how your personal connection might inform your hopes for its future. Thank you, and I am turning it over to Ellie Inslee, who is our moderator.
Hi, everyone. It's an honor to be here moderating. My only job here, though, is to make sure that this meeting moves forward and that we get all the information out to you and that we hear back from you. So we're going to be here for 2 hours. We have a lot of information to impart. The first 30 minutes is basically going to be the background and context. You all have agendas on your tables. Those of you who are in the back, sorry, we really weren't, I can't say that we were expecting quite this many people. This is an enormous and fantastic turnout. But basically, to go over the agenda really quickly, the first part, for about 30 minutes, we have a number of speakers who are going to be talking about the background and context of the whole SDC and the planning process that's been going on. A lot has happened in the last few months, and there's a lot to explain to you. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the goals and guiding principles that the forum has come up with a lot of information from the past documentation that's been going on. And then we'll be talking about potential governance of the property once it transitions away from the developmental center. And there's some options about that. Some of them are very interesting and complicated. So after each one of these segments, we have time for questions. So we're going to be stuffing you with information in a good way, and we want you to ask questions. So it's really important that we hear back from you. That's probably the most important thing that's going to be happening tonight, that we get your feedback about the information you're receiving. We're going to have a very brief break, and then we're going to assemble into breakout sessions. So each one of these adorable little tables with 8 seats is going to be a place for a breakout session. And then you'll have a chance to actually discuss some of the things you've heard and ask questions, answer questions, and I'll explain that a little bit when we get to that point. I also want to talk briefly about our ground rules for the meeting. As you can see, we're in a very echoey gymnasium, so the last ground rule is probably the most important, which is limit side conversations, because we will be able to hear you all the way to the front if you're in the corner. Please keep your cell phones off. And as we're talking, please listen with an open mind, even if you think you've heard this information before. There's a lot of new nuances and subtleties. Remember, we're working together as a community. I think that's really significant. Stick with constructive comments and questions. By the way, the ground rules are up on that sheet right there. Be respectful of others' ideas. Be brief with your questions. We're not going to be able to take everyone's questions. As Leslie said, there are cards on the table. You can write questions down, put your email or phone number on it if you want us to hear back from you. And then again, limit side conversations. So with that, oh yeah, and that's where with that jar with the question on it, you can put your cards there afterwards. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, Richard Dale with the Sonoma Ecology Center. And everybody, when you come up, introduce yourselves and say who you are.
This is a really great crowd, and the thing I really wanted to get across, perhaps more than anything, is this is our chance to make a difference. This is a long process, but it's also one that has some pieces that we really need the community to weigh in on. And if the community isn't there, this process really won't succeed. So we really, really value you all being here. I have an impossible task. I have to try and compress 130 years into about 3 or 4 minutes here. So I'm going to read from some notes, and it's going to be pretty dry, but I'm going to try and get across some information. So forgive me for this not being very entertaining, but so here's a timeline of planning efforts that have happened around the SDC campus. And for those of you who are not completely familiar with the campus, it's originally 1,640 acres, and it stretched from where Highway 12 is all the way across the valley and up to the top of Sonoma Mountain. And now, after some transfers that I'll talk to you about, it's about 837 acres remaining, and that's what we're focusing on this evening. Can most of you kind of imagine that? It's this outlined area on this map over here, and there are other maps around the room. Unfortunately, it's a lot more crowded than we were expecting, but hopefully you'll have that image in your mind as we're talking about some of this. So in 1890, that initial 1,640 acres were acquired for a whopping $51,000. That's 1.3 million in today's dollars. But the exciting thing about it was envisioned kind of as a utopia. And it was seen as an area that not only could be helping people with developmental disabilities, but it could be self-sufficient, and it could be a healing place just in virtue of what it was. So over the years, it evolved more and more into a place that was in fact self-sufficient. There are phenomenal water resources on the campus. There are great soils and all kinds of different habitat that I'll talk about in another section. But it made a place that was vital and vibrant, and a great place to be living and a great place to be healing. Things started changing after this campus really evolved into this thriving city. At one point, I think we'll hear more about this, but there were 5,000 residents and thousands of employees. It was a big operation, and certainly the largest thing going on in this part of the county. In 1969, though, as things began to change on the campus, 162 acres were declared surplus, and that turned into Sonoma Valley Regional Park in 1974. The county paid $100,000 for that transfer. I'm rounding up here, it was $97,000. In 1983, there was another surplus declared, 41 acres along Highway 12 in the northeast corner, and that was also turned into a conversation that took a long time, but eventually in 2007 was transferred to county parks. In 1994, a resident of Sonoma Valley and a person who worked at the developmental center had this brainstorm that there are very few places left in the whole North Bay that connect mountain ridges, and envisioned that there could be a habitat corridor, a wildlife corridor that crossed between Snow Mountain and Mayacamas. And working with the Ecology Center and a number of experts around the area and county agencies, we were able to establish this habitat corridor and eventually got it into the general plan in 2008. But not soon after this project began, another round of surplus lands was declared in 1995, 600 acres of the upper part of the property. And this brought some proposals for vineyard leasing and other development that brought the community to its feet, really an uproar. And there's some people in this room we have to thank for all that work that happened around that. But at the end of that process, especially led by Sonoma Mountain Preservation and backed by Ecology Center and Parent Hospital Association and others, there was eventually a 290-acre easement put across the top of the parcel, and then a 600-acre transfer to state parks. And that was in 2002 that finally happened. And that's sort of the fundamental shape of the property now. I should also mention that in 2004, some of us worked closely with then Assemblywoman Pat Wiggins to create a bill and eventually pass that bill through the legislature to protect all the open space lands of Sonoma Developmental Center should it ever close or be surplused. That passed, it got to Governor Schwarzenegger and he vetoed it. And he said it was unnecessary. We don't quite understand why he said that, but that was the process that we were in the middle of then. So here we are. So then about 5 or 6 years passed since the work that was done, and actually more like 10 years, and we realized that things were beginning to change again. The atmosphere was really happening now that there was going to be closure. So a number of us got together, starting with the Land Trust and the Ecology Center, eventually branching out into working with Snow Mountain Preservation, and then we brought on Supervisor Gorin, who I notice has just arrived here, and created an important organization that was really not an organization, but a place where people came together to discuss ideas, the SDC Coalition. And this work, starting in 2012 and culminating in 2015, put together what we felt was a coherent community vision for the time. Hundreds of people, even more people than were in the room tonight, were at this meeting in 2015, and we articulated our thoughts and came together on a consensus vision. I want to just read it. That SDC will create a public-private partnership driven by the community ideas and values that showcases the site's history, maintains critical services for the development of the disabled, provides opportunities for creative reuse of SDC's assets, and preserves the natural resources and open space of the site. 2 weeks later, the closure was announced. All of us who've been working with this coalition, including a lot of state agencies and others in the conversation, trying to figure out how we could engage the community and bring this process forward, just again, we're feeling very blindsided by the whole process. We had been working with the state and suddenly this news came. But the writing had been on the wall for a while, and so we continued forward. The interesting thing about this was that the state pledged that this was going to be a different kind of transformation. It was not going to just be a simple closure, it was going to protect the wildlands, and it was going to involve the community. And so they began a process, which is still in progress, to assess the site and to then bring the community together to discuss options for the site. Unfortunately, that process, as things can happen with the state, has dragged on, and just a few weeks ago, we had the final meeting of the assessment, just for a group that's looking at the assessment before it comes to a public meeting, which will probably be in a couple of months. And the governor, who has led the administration that is pledging to keep the land wild and the community involved, is retiring in November. So we have some work ahead of us, and Tracy's going to talk a little bit more about that in just a minute, but just wanted to mention that the closure is now slated for December. The Department of Developmental Services assures us that all the residents will be taken care of, but they will be out by the end of November. There's about 120 or so left. Maybe less than that now, that's the last number I heard. So then it goes into warm shutdown, and that warm shutdown, because of the complexity of the facilities, which Tracy will also talk about, is very expensive. So there's going to be increasing pressure to do something perhaps that we don't want to see happen here. So again, it's really important that we're all together and thinking about the future. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tracy Salcido, and I'm a member of the SDC Eldridge Committee of the Glen Ellen Forum. And I just want to, I see a lot of people standing. There are several seats up front here if you'd like to have a seat. So just keep that in mind. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the last part of what Richard was talking about, which is a site assessment that was done by the state of California. They hired a design firm called Wallace, Roberts & Todd, or WRT, and they were contracted to perform the site assessment. The firm looked at everything from traffic patterns to infrastructures, the status of the buildings, the status of the wildlands, trails, just about everything that was on that property. And it generated a very thorough overview of what was on the property. This was presented in September, and the forum was actually included as part of that community advisory council that they created. So, good, I'm glad people are sitting. So we were part of that. In terms of open space, we as Glen Ellenites, we kind of knew it all. But the state of California probably didn't because, you know, it's a big state. So it was really good to have that kind of overview from WRT. New and good information as far as Glen Ellen is concerned was generated regarding the campus itself and the status of the buildings and the infrastructure on the campus. Not only their condition, but also their configuration, how they're laid out on the ground and how they're served. Significant is that it's really one contained system. Unless a single user takes over, that system will have to be broken apart. So all of the electrical system, all of the water system, all of the sewer system, it's just essentially, if you look at the pictures of it, it's a trunk line with things going off of it, and that would all have to be broken apart to accommodate a bunch of different uses on the property. In the event that a single user, like a university for example, were to occupy the site, that infrastructure still has to be upgraded or where obsolete, replaced, and there's quite a bit of obsolete infrastructure on the property. The most obvious is the steam power plant. It's got an old steam power plant up there, and that's what provides heat and cooling to the property, and it's obsolete. It has to be replaced. Everything else will have to be brought up to code, and that also is expensive. And WRT generated some numbers to attach to that cost. The assumptions that were used for those are no longer valid because we had a big fire. And so all of the costs that they had determined, which probably were pretty conservative, are obsolete. I mean, as obsolete as the steam power plant because everything's more expensive now. We can talk about the specifics of the findings, and the thing is WRT will be having a meeting in probably May or June where we can get all of those details if we want them. For the purposes of this meeting, there are two things that are really important. One is that the state reiterated that it does not want to sell the property, that it does not want to surplus that property. And the second thing it reiterated was that the process of determining what happens at SDC should be community driven. So the state has closed several other, the state has closed several other developmental centers in the area, in the state, and in no other location has it seen this kind of turnout. And it's paying attention. And that's why the Glen Ellen Forum is at the table. So keep in mind, and we'll keep you posted on this, WRT will be coming back and making more, giving you more detail on that kind of thing. And I did not bring my agenda with me, so who's next? Oh, it's Richard again.
This is probably even a harder task, and that's sort of reducing all the natural resources and open space sort of values of the property into a couple minutes. The first thing I would say about the campus is that it's not the campus, it's the whole property and its setting. It's visually stunning. It is the heart of Sonoma Valley. It's what kind of gives it the character. And I'd also say that character is also embodied in the people who've lived and worked there for this last century. There's a kindness and a gentleness and a creativity that I think influences our whole community, and we have a lot to thank for SDC having been there. I'm looking at Teresa and I'm going to start crying here. So from a biodiversity standpoint, it's a phenomenal resource. There are 129 birds, 102 of those breeding types of species, breeding species, 11 amphibians, 16 reptiles, 43 mammals, a bunch of different kinds of vegetation types, and grasslands and wetlands and woodlands and all these things that make it just sort of diverse and interesting as you walk through it and you feel it. It's got a whole bunch of threatened and endangered species, things like Pacific tiger salamander, steelhead trout, northern spotted owl, California freshwater shrimp, 6 rare plants. It also has the things that we love to see there, like the beaver and the dams and the otters, and if you're lucky you get to see occasionally a mountain lion running in the distance, or a coyote or so. It's really a place where we experience nature, and it has all these things inherent to it. I always feel that biodiversity is an indicator of whether a place feels healthy and feels like it's welcoming. And that place is welcoming. It has all those things going on. It also is really important from a biodiversity standpoint because topographically it starts at the valley bottom and goes all the way up. And that means for plant communities, as they adapt to temperature changes, they can move up the side of the hill too, and then the animals can move with them. So it's a really important refuge to have that kind of a space protected. Water resources. I mentioned earlier that the water was one of the reasons the place was located where it was because there was a lot of water on the site. Between Asbury Creek and, I only learned recently it was Hill Creek, not Mill Creek, and Roulette Springs, which feed the two main reservoirs. There's a lot of water that's there, and when there were thousands of people living and more working on the site, it could handle all the water needs for that whole facility. It also has a phenomenal opportunity for groundwater recharge because the big valley area behind it isn't developed, and there's opportunity to do things in a period that's really starved for having solutions to groundwater problems. So it has all those potentials in the water equation. The wildlife corridor, as I mentioned, is a really important facet of it too. This is a place that has this very unique setting between these two mountain ridges that still has a lot of protected land that connects it. It's a pinch point, and yet it is a critical piece of this wildlife corridor. And corridors are significant because if you turn anything like a mountain range into an island, biodiversity begins to plummet on it. We've learned that from island biogeography studies. So this is a really critical wildlife corridor, but it turns out it's not just around the Sonoma Valley and the North Bay. It connects to the Marin area and to the Blue Ridge Berryessa National Monument area in the interior. So this is a really important piece of land ecologically. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention the SDC coalition had a lands committee and then reformed when we heard about the closure. And we in the lands committee have been meeting, trying to put together our thoughts to sort of talk about a lot of the things that I was just saying, and recently sort of put together our vision, which will be going out as part of a paper that we'll be putting out in a couple of weeks here, and I'm happy to share with everyone. But the vision for the Lands Committee is the open space lands, water resources, and diverse natural habitats on the property are permanently protected for people and wildlife, that the land sustains habitat connectivity for native plant and wildlife species, allows for increased groundwater recharge for Sonoma Valley, moderates the effect of climate change on our region. It's a permanent greenbelt, community separator between Sonoma and Glen Ellen, with opportunities for compatible recreation and sustainable ag. But the important thing, I think, also about this, we as a voting community, I think my time's up. Last year, 2016, voted over 70%, overwhelmingly, to put community separators around in our county, and especially we felt SDC was critical when we were working on that, because it has this capacity to separate Glen Ellen and Sonoma and keep something wild kind of between them as development occurs. My time's up.
I hope many of you can come to our party this Saturday afternoon. It's going to be kind of neat. And if a few of you come early, like around 10 o'clock in the morning, help set it up, that'd be neat too. Oh, I'm Jim. Jim. Oh, I'm Jim Shear. I'm Jim Shear from the Glen Ellen Historical Society. Thank you, sir. The Glen Ellen Historical Society has been part of the SDC coalition from the very beginning. And it's glad to be partnered with the Sonoma Land Trust, the Sonoma Ecology Center, and the Glen Ellen Forum, as we work together on a new framework to provide governance for that property in perpetuity. Although SDC is closing this year, this place known as Eldridge will remain an important part of Glen Ellen for many, many more years. Our main concern about the closure of SDC is the preservation of the great sweep of human history that's taken place at Eldridge. For thousands of years, Native Americans had lived there lightly in an abundant and generous natural landscape. And there's a great deal of evidence of their existence to this day, undisturbed, that must remain respected and protected. Then, a little over 100 years ago, in 1891, a retired sea captain by the name of Oliver Eldridge was commissioned by two prominent San Francisco women, Julia Judah and Frances Bentley, each with disabled children of their own, to find a place for the creation of a home for the profoundly disabled, the first of its kind west of the Mississippi, which was then called the California Home for the Care and Training of Feeble-Minded Children, although the place where this home was located was actually called Eldridge, named after the captain. Over the 126 years since then, an enormous diversity of residents with a wide variety of the most profound medical disabilities have lived there. while attitudes and treatment protocols gradually evolved over the century, prompting significant changes in the names of the place. The California Home for the Care and Training of Feeble-Minded Children was soon renamed in 1909 as the Sonoma State Home, in 1953 as the Sonoma State Hospital, and then in 1986 as the Sonoma Developmental Center, or SDC. The resident population grew to over 4,000 at one point, with thousands employed in their care. The institution was by then the largest developmental center in the country, along with being the greatest employer in the valley, deeply influencing the character of the whole region by attracting altruistic, caring, skilled, compassionate, and idiosyncratic, maverick, nonconformists to this area. Many of whom, with their families, still live here today. Many of them are in this room. And at this moment, I want to say we salute you. This knowledgeable staff created significant innovations in the field, for the entire field, such as adaptive engineering, specializing in custom seating for wheelchairs, and adaptive equipment. The Equestrian Center, which has become a standard in psychotherapy, and a reduction of the dependency on medications to an individually designed protocol, from shifting from a congregate to a semi-private accommodation. The Glen Ellen Historic Society has plans to establish a historic park at Eldridge, reaching from the stone gates of Arnold Drive to the cemetery above the campus. The park would include several buildings and architectural styles that range from the 19th century Gothic style of that majestic brick building, through the examples of English cottage, Tudor, arts and crafts styles of the early 20th century, and to the contemporary international styles of the late 20th century. A museum that had been established in the superintendent's mansion back in 1972 would finally be open to the public, with a research library based upon the records and artifacts that have been gathered there throughout the past decades. Perhaps the location we found here as well for the Sonoma County Archives, making Eldridge a recognized center for historical study, with an accompanying conference center for training and presentations. But especially significant to us would be the establishment of a memorial park at the cemetery, where over 2,000 residents of the institution are interred, with benches along pathways, so visitors may pause to consider the memory and legacy of everyone who ever lived there or worked there, in this gorgeous place we call Eldridge. The Glen Ellen Historical Society is prepared to work with this coalition, with other organizations, and with the population of Glen Ellen itself, the people, in order to create a future that remembers its past.
Okay, I'm speaking to you as a maverick now. We're going to move from the past and what's been done before, and we're going to look ahead. And that's actually what we're all here for. So there are two things that you need to know. This process is moving very fast right now. And the reason it's moving fast is, number one, because the facility closes in December. Once it closes, it moves into the warm shutdown, which you've heard mentioned. That means it's no longer an active campus, but they're going to keep the lights on. There'll be a few people, kind of wandering around. Well, they'll be supervising, obviously. The idea would be to keep other people from wandering around.
Speak into the microphone, please.
Pardon?
Speak into the microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Let's see. So following that shutdown, there's the potential. Okay, the warm shutdown will cost about $1 million a month. Following that shutdown, there's a potential for degradation of the on-site resources, occupancy by vagrants, and vandalism. The other part of the urgency is that Governor Jerry Brown would like to see this whole process through by the time his term ends at the end of the year. The state, under Brown's watch, has stated, again, that it doesn't intend to surplus or sell the property. The state also has specifically said that it understands the property is different, and it wants the process to be community-driven. And that's why we're here. Glen Ellen is not only Glen Ellen, but also part of a greater community that includes Sonoma Valley and Sonoma County. The SDC Eldridge Committee has fostered partnerships with the Land Trust, Sonoma Land Trust, Sonoma Ecology Center, and the Glen Ellen Historical Society, as well as Susan Gorin. Oh, where'd you go? Recognizing our interconnectedness. I'm sure you all feel a bit like I do. I'm using the metaphor of being on a train, and I've been cultivating this. It's kind of a mashup of being on a railroad tracks. Some of the tracks are running in parallel directions. Sometimes it feels like we were late to the station and we missed the train. Sometimes it feels like we're sitting in the middle of the track and we're blindfolded and deaf and something's just rolling up toward us. We don't know what it is. But now we find ourselves with a seat in the club car. The train is rolling and it's full of people having conversations, and we don't know what those conversations all are, but we know that at our table some people are listening. And one more thing, this is a bullet train. It's going fast. So we're finding our bearings, and this is part of what we're doing to find our bearings. Now we need to map out where we're going and how we're going to get there, what we want and how we get it. We have to remember that compromises are going to be part of this process. No one is going to get everything that they want. We also have to remember that we can't get anything that we want unless we have a vehicle in place that allows us to not only voice our opinions, but also for those opinions to carry some weight. So we've got a train, we've got a seat on the train. We've also got goals and objectives, and that's what we're going to share with you now, a vision. I'm going to turn it over to Steve Lee, who will share the goals and objectives that we have come up with.
Hi everyone, Steve Lee, member of the Eldridge Committee of the Forum, also a long-term Glen Ellen resident, born and raised here, went to this very school. And I live right next to this property. My property borders this property, so anything that happens here matters a lot to me and my family. So we were set to the task with this committee of coming up with some of our goals, the things that we wanted to see happen with this property, should we have a voice in this regard. And so I'm just going to quickly run through those goals with you, and then we'll move on from there. One of the things I wanted to point out is that these goals are pretty consistent with the goals set forth in the 2015 Transition SDC meeting that was held back then. The primary thing that was at the top of all of our minds was protecting the open space, protecting the wildlife corridor and all of the open space parts of the property. We also wanted to foster development and uses that promote and benefit Glen Ellen, the Glen Ellen community, and residents, with an emphasis on community rather than tourism. So that was important to us. We recognize that this property can't just be protected so we all walk through the hills. It's cost a lot of money for the state. It's got to produce economic output. And so we also set aside as one of our goals to make sure that we wanted to promote, and support this creation of a viable economic engine. And that includes jobs. There's a lot of jobs that have been lost in our community, and that's something that's important to me personally and to our committee. To preserve the site's historic character, Jim talked about that as well. That's also part of our hopes. And also to preserve the site's healthcare legacy. We wanted to transition. All of us really didn't want this thing to close at all. We really wanted this place to stay open. We all know that we're past that at this point. But we hope that through this process, and not just with the historic district, but we promote preserving the healthcare legacy of this place for the development of disabled. We want to preserve the semi-rural character of Glen Ellen. I think we all feel that way. We are keenly aware of the overburdening of resources in our area. We are already stressed for water in our valley. We're already stressed for sewage in our valley, and roads are a problem in our valley. So watching out for all of those things is an important part of what we're interested in. That goes along with maintaining the existing circulation arteries, the existing roads, not having a whole bunch of new development of circulation arteries in the area, and levels of service. Encouraging reuse of the existing structures and staying within the existing building footprints to the extent practicable. And to ensure that Glen Ellen is the last thing is just to, again, we've already said this, but to make sure that Glen Ellen is included in the community-driven process to develop a master plan for the future of the Eldridge redevelopment. So those were the goals that we set out as our little committee for this forum for you people. And hopefully that's consistent with what all of you feel. And now we're going to move on we're going to do questions, and then after that we're going to move on to the governance models and so forth.
Hi, thank you for this evening. I'm very engaged with this. I was one of the people that fought off the vineyard development that Richard talked about. Mostly I've been hearing that this is a long-term process.
Can you give your name?
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm Jerry Burnham. Thank you. Mostly I've been hearing that this is a long-term process, and then tonight I hear it's a fast-moving process. So that tells me that something that's final and irreversible is going to be happening in the near future, but I'm not clear what that is. So that's my question.
Yeah, you're right. Things have changed, and part of what's happened is that it's kind of hard to describe, but it has to do with the fires. It has to do with a lot of stuff that's just kind of come together at the same time. The main reason that we're doing what we're doing right now is because there is a plan out there, and we can be a part of that. And you'll hear more about that in a little bit, but it's hopefully something that everybody can buy into, and it can happen fast so that we don't have this warm shutdown, and we don't have a piece of land sitting there that's undeveloped and fallen apart. So if you can be a little patient, we'll kind of get to that.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Temporarily.
Okay, all right.
I would also just add that there was supposed to be a second phase in the WRT process that was going to engage the community in this process. They've run out of time, and then we see this sort of end of the road coming with the governor leaving and the whole administration turning over and stuff. So, thanks, Jerry.
We have time for 2 more questions. So, who would like to be one of the 2? Over here. Yes, I think I saw.
Thank you. Do we have any updated requirements or parameters financially from the state that we have to work within?
Do we have any updated financial parameters from the state within which we have to work?
I wish. No, not yet. No.
Not really yet. We know that it can't cost the state a lot of money, or it's, they're not going to go for it.
Got to break even.
We'll get to that.
Another question? Yes.
Mark, are there any interested parties in actually using the existing buildings? And are there developers trying to convince the governor that they can develop this property to their own benefit?
Are there any developers who are trying to convince the governor that to sell them the property? What was the first part of your question? Are there any interactive users?
Community people interested in using the facilities?
Are there any community members interested in using the facilities?
There are a lot. There are a lot of community members. The Ecology Center, one of them, but Transcendence and several others who stepped forward who have an interest. There are a lot of proposals we've heard from the administration, and they're holding them off while they listen to the community and sort of see what we come up with is what we kind of understand. But we'll get into more of this in a second.
One last question.
Well, if people make proposals such as you're talking about, so there's a lot of interested parties making proposals, will they be presented to the community to consider, or is it just that you're supposed to develop an idea or connect it together?
Did everybody hear that question? No. Okay. If there are these other proposals, will we find out about them, or are we supposed to come up with our own?
Or you, as a committee or as this group, community forum, be able to consider those proposals and have deep input into them as you're doing that and maybe developing?
So yeah, will they come to the attention of this committee, and can they incorporate them into the decision-making process?
Yes, yes. So that's the brilliant thing about what we're doing right now, and the fact that we've got a seat on this, in this club car. And there are ways that everybody here can have that land use question, you know, what's gonna be there? How's it gonna be put on there? The idea is that, yes, we will have a voice in that, and you'll hear more about that in just a minute.
Okay, so it's time to move on to the next topic, future governance models. And the first, well, John and or Tracy, which one of you is going to be? John, right.
So I'm here to talk about governance and to set the stage for Tracy and the forum to talk about the options of governance. In 2015, we, as Richard was describing, held a big community meeting in May, and then the closure announcement happened 2 weeks later. And one of the things that we've kind of decided strategically along the way is we want to get out in front of the state. The state, just a couple things that I think we've heard over and over again, is the state wants to own this property and keep it. Not exactly sure of all the reasons why, but they also view it as more of a liability than an asset. Everything we've been talking about in terms of the state of the buildings, the state of the infrastructure. You can't put a value on the natural lands part, but you sort of can. So if you look at the water resources and the land itself, there's value there. The state has said they don't want to sell the property. We'll take them at their word until we hear otherwise. But they also don't know what to do with it, and they've said that repeatedly. The governance question is, to me, there's a discipline issue we all have to deal with now, which is how are we going to make decisions about SDC, not what are the actual range of uses, the laundry list that we all want to see. And we've had multiple community meetings where, and it'll happen tonight, and it's okay, but how we make decisions and who makes them is just as important as the mix of uses that we ultimately decide upon. The job of the land trust in this whole thing, my job when I got hired 5 years ago, primarily because of SDC, is to protect the open space land. Our goal has been concurrent with closure, that we have a deal with the state to protect, and the open space land, you could say roughly, is everything outside of the campus, but it's not that simple either. So if you could just, there's a lot of land up on the slopes of the mountain, a lot of land to the east of the campus, and land in the campus itself that we all want to see protected. But we have to deal with the campus, the facility, and the governance question, because the Department of Developmental Services, when the key turns and the last resident leaves, they may have some residual role of cleaning up, but they're not going to operate this place anymore. And there is no entity in state government that is set up to do that. It's too complicated. It could be a park, it could be a college campus, it could be a housing development, it could be so many things, and there's no institution to do that. So we, back in 2015, through the SDC Coalition and Susan's leadership, commissioned a study by a group called the Potrero Group. And if you go to the Transform SDC website, where we've been posting everything since this all started, you can read the report. Potrero looked at models from all over the country of military-based closures, hospital closures similar to SDC, all kinds of institutions that were truly permanently changing their use, so what to do. The models that are out there are, I'm sure we can, if we spend enough time, come up with a hybrid, but there's 3 basic models that Potrero identified. If the state is going to keep ownership, then there can be a state entity, agency, that manages the property. That's relatively straightforward. That could be a partnership between multiple agencies, but that's model number 1. The second would be a public-private partnership, where the state still retains ownership, but they enter into a long-term lease, a 99-year lease, with a master developer who uses their financing capacity to build and operate whatever it is that the state has decided they want to contract for. So that's public-private partnership. You could sell the property, which thankfully right now isn't on the table, but you could certainly just sell the property. Other developmental centers in California have been sold. Others have been transferred into the CSU system. So it's been a different story in each community. The third model, and the one that, as the land trust, hopefully as the community learns more about this, a broader group supports the idea of a new entity, which would be a state, it would be managed and part of the state of California, but like the Presidio Trust, when the Presidio closed, they set up a nonprofit federal corporation to manage the property. So that model, which we have looked at in depth, is one that we think is worth a lot of conversation and dialogue here. That there would be a new entity whose sole mission would be to take care of this place, and of course to make some money off of it so you could keep operating it. So those are roughly the models. Again, the Potrero group, like Potrero Hill, did this study. It's on the Transform SDC website. It's really readable. It's really interesting, and we get to talk about a real-world application of it here. So.
Okay, so hope y'all can keep up here. So the committee, the SDC Eldridge Committee likes this trust idea. And I'm going to give you a bit of background about what a Presidio-style trust is. The Eldridge Trust would be different, and we're going to call it the Eldridge Trust because that's what it would be. In 1994, the U.S. Army transferred the Presidio of San Francisco, a military installation on the tip of San Francisco Peninsula, established in 1776 by Spanish colonists, to the National Park Service. But the National Park Service did not. The National Park Service didn't have enough money to operate the park. So the property was transferred to a newly created Presidio Trust, a federal agency created by Congress. The new nonprofit was given a two-pronged mission to make the park financially self-sufficient within a 10-year period by 2013, and to bolster the natural and cultural resources that make the park a valuable asset in the federal park system. It happens to be consistently the most visited park in the National Park Service. And obviously, the trust met both goals beautifully. There are some similarities between what would be an Eldridge Trust and what would be a Presidio Trust. The preservation of properties with long and important histories, a long-standing integration of the properties in the psyches and infrastructure of the surrounding communities, and the properties represent prime real estate, being ogled by a number of interested parties. Differences: the Presidio's in the city and Eldridge in the country. And the Presidio was a federal transfer, and the Eldridge would be a state transfer. To form a trust, three things have to be in place. First, legislation that can be passed through the state assembly in time to get funding for seed money. There's a short window for this. It's actually like 60 days. And a draft of this kind of legislation is actually in the works. It's not final, and again, Glen Ellen presently has a say in the language that would be part of that trust. We also need a viable financial plan. A model for developing that is being developed right now. At the least, as we understand it, and we've asked this question a number of times, what kind of money do you want to see, state of California? What do you need to see? We don't know, we've never been told. So we're shooting for zero sum. We just want to make sure it breaks even. And that's going to be what we base a financial model on, or what we would like to see, what Glen Ellen hopefully would like to see that model based on. One thing, Eldridge cannot be a fiscal liability. That would change everything. And then community input and support. That is one of the things that the state of California wants. And that's what we're doing right now. So speak up when we get to the part about questions. Pros and cons. A trust has the potential to create something new and wonderful at Eldridge using a model that's proven, durable, and that can be crafted with enough flexibility to meet the current and future needs of this community. A trust offers the best possibility for ongoing community input. A trust maintains the property in the public domain, which means all decisions about land use are subject to public scrutiny and input. The cons: there's no guarantee that a Glen Ellen resident could hold a legislative spot on the trust board. And there's no guarantee that the trust board would implement the specific requests of Glen Ellen in its land use decisions. I have the elements of the trust here. Would you guys like to hear them? The other thing I could do is I've got copies and I can put them on the tables, but I could also read them really quickly. Okay, all right, so these are the nuts and the bolts of how an Eldridge trust would work. The trust would be charged with managing the Eldridge property in the public interest, including making decisions on land use. The guiding principles of the trust would be explicit. It would be charged with adhering to those principles. The trust would be a state-owned nonprofit organization, or an NGO. The trust would be governed by a board of directors composed of 9 members, including, potentially, a representative from the CSU system, a representative, or California State University system, a representative from the State Department of Natural Resources, a representative of the state of Sonoma County, chosen by the county, and 6 ad hoc members, ideally including at least 1 resident of Glen Ellen, appointed by the state of California. The executive director or CEO of the trust would also be on the board. The trust would initially be funded by seed money from the state of California. The amount of public support would decrease over a set number of years as revenues from land use on the property increase. The initial goal is just solvency. Should the trust generate residual income or profit, this would be used for improvements on that property. The trust would be run by a paid executive, CEO, and staff. The trust would have the authority to enter into agreements, leases, and contracts with governmental, private, and public entities. These agreements would run the gamut, including contracting services for rehabilitation of buildings on the property, for housing or businesses, and management or transfer of open space to other state entities. Protection of open space. So that's the nuts and bolts. Let me find my concluding remarks here. Okay, so the outcome of this could be the same as the Presidios. A blend of open space and commercial and residential occupancy that are complementary within the confines of the property and that are compatible with our surrounding community. And that becomes something that the state of California, the county of Sonoma, and the town of Glen Ellen could be proud of. The key is this can't be done in a hurry. If a trust is in place, Glen Ellen has the opportunity to establish site control and governance and to secure the time it needs with its partners to implement a community-based vision.
Tracy, did you just say can or cannot be done in a hurry?
Oh, can't, no, it can't be done in a short amount of time. Is that what you're saying? No, yeah, we need time. And the trust gives us time. I'm sorry. Okay, trying to go slow. So yeah, the trust gives us time. We would have a set amount of time to develop a plan that we could all live with. One of the organizers of this forum group here mentioned the idea of trust. And I think that's significant. It's something that we need to think about. I mean, we'd be establishing a trust, but we'd also have to trust the trust. We'd have to have some level of confidence, and that's worth just thinking about. And part of that is that cultivating a vision for the Eldridge property and then implementing it can't be done by a committee of 200. We have to be confident that our suggestions will be heard and considered. One thing's for sure, this room's full, and that means we can't be ignored. Vicki Hill and I, we're currently representing what's happening here. So it's important that, we be here and hear this. We'll be the messengers, at least for the time being. We don't have to be the messengers always, but, just keep that in mind that there has to be a messenger. So if something goes wrong, don't shoot us. Okay. And we don't have the answers. We don't even have all the questions. And that's what the next part of this is all about, articulating what Glen Ellen wants and finding a way and the time to do it right. So with that, we'll go into breakout.
Thank you, Tracy and John. We actually have the honor of having Susan Gorin, Supervisor Gorin, speak. She's right here.
First of all, let me say that it's been a labor of love for me to work with a great leadership team and an entire coalition and great community members to really talk about the future of what we think as the most important land use issue facing Sonoma Valley. And we knew this going forward, and we knew that this would be a riveting issue for the community because this has been part of our fabric for generations. And I think it's really important to recognize, first of all, that we started out as a coalition. It was about the land. And Mickey Cook is here, and Ted Elliott here, representing Sonoma Preservation Group, and the Sonoma Land Trust, and of course, the Sonoma Ecology Center. But then, and I don't see her in the audience, but when Kathleen Miller joined the coalition as the president of the Parent Hospital Association, she became the heart of our coalition, and quickly our discussions over the last 5 years have really involved the importance of the Sonoma Developmental Center as a caregiving institution, employer, and home for so many residents over multiple years. And quite frankly, you haven't heard about the coalition moving forward because we've been busy trying to advocate to keep the center open. That didn't work. To advocate for an alternative model of caregiving, and we still haven't lost hope. Maybe we will get some element of that on the campus, but that seemingly is not working, and the state is determined, developmental services absolutely determined, for financial reasons as well as philosophical reasons, that they will close the center as a place of caregiving. And I recognize that. I think we all recognize that it was just a matter of time. So we, Jerry, there is no one more frustrated than I am about the fact that we've been talking with the state for 5 years, and suddenly we have to develop a model of fiscal sustainability in 6 weeks. Come on, guys, really. But I want you to know that we have representatives from our state legislators here. Pat Sabo is representing Mike McGuire. And Logan Pitts, are you here? He was supposed to be here, but maybe the assembly member, Cecilia Aguiar-Curry, has a representative. But I did see Rebecca Hermosillo representing Congressman Mike Thompson. They are here, and they are listening. And there's Rebecca at the back of the room. What Tracy really talked about are the specifics of one model. And we're really talking about, the group of us, ever-expanding model of us, are talking about what the concept of a trust might look like for Sonoma Developmental Center. Would that engender trust in the community? Would it be able to hold a community engaged, fully fleshed out community engagement process to help us express and advocate for what we want to see on the site? I have confidence that it will, but the specifics that she talked about are really just one model. I think the message that I have to give you, though, is we need to get our act together because our state electeds and the state governor and Department of Developmental Services will not have confidence in a model as that we develop unless we have consensus in the community and not complete agreement, but just an element of trust that we have the resources and the fiscal abilities to actually pull this off, much as the Presidio did. And you may be heartened to know that we have representatives from the Presidio Nonprofit Trust who actually live in Sonoma Valley, and they are part of our conversations and leading us through this process. But everything is really up in the air. There's nothing specific other than a trust might be one way that we might move this forward in a very short amount of time. So we have some language in our general plan to help guide us through this, to make it clear that this land use planning is not in isolation from the planning for the rest of the valley and the rest of the county. But we are thrilled that Tracy is a part of a group representing you and helping us figure it out. And I absolutely assure you, and I assure you from all of the electeds' perspective, we are very supportive of a community-driven process to move this issue forward. So thanks so much for being here tonight.
That was great. Thank you so much, Susan.
Ellie,
Yeah.
could somebody up there please explain what the 6 weeks and 60-day deadlines being driven by?
First question. The 6 weeks, explain the 6 weeks and 60 days. So who would like to take that on? Because, John, thank you.
Jay, so there's things, it's like, remember a previous administration, there's the known knowns and the known unknowns, and things we know. Governor's leaving office. He does not want to leave his successor with a mess. We do. So the governor doesn't want to leave a mess on his hands. If the developmental center is going to close at the end of this year, whoever succeeds him will either have a warm shutdown and nobody in charge, or perhaps a solution. So what we've learned from folks who, I've never talked to Chair Brown myself about this, but people in his administration, there is an opportunity, part of the May revise, which is the state's, right before the state budget process, is budget approved by the end of June. Okay, it's fiscal year 18-19 budget they're working on right now. If we could, offering this invitation, this opportunity to come up with the solution for governance and financing, if we can get our act together, we've been offered a chance to try to get that into the budget process. So does that make sense? Okay. Now, if we miss a window that's a 60-day window, legislature's in town until the end of August. Governor, we've been told if we don't get this resolved before they leave town, it will pass to the next administration. It's important. I think we've learned that the governor cares about SDC. When the evacuation occurred and all the residents and staff were moved to Dixon, the governor personally was checking in regularly about the status of the clients and the people and making things happen to take care of them. So SDC is on his personal radar. Is it the most important thing? No, but it's important. Is that enough? Is that?
Yeah, I understand what's right.
Okay.
So we have time for a couple more questions, and then we'll do the breakout sessions. Raise your hand, I can't see you. Oh, there you are.
So earlier you said that this is all going forward, you're thinking about all this, but if it becomes a fiscal liability, everything's out the window. So I worked there for many years. I know the condition of this property. I know that the monetary rebuild of this facility is going to be extraordinary. So my question is, if it becomes a fiscal liability, what are your plans?
If it becomes a fiscal liability, what is the plan? I'm not sure.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
We thought we would deliver it to you in a nice little package. The short answer is we're working on it. There has to be a modeling done to see what the different options turn out. If it turns out to be a huge liability, there isn't a win or a solution. But we feel that there can be a solution and it needs to be explored. And so we have got some of the best minds we could find who've been through this in a number of different ways, helping to try and put it together. But this is another reason why it's really great to have a whole community know about these kinds of things, because your ideas are critical.
Do you want to say who some of those minds are?
I don't know, am I allowed to give names? Sounds like I should be, they're being public citizens but wanting to be anonymous, so I'm apparently not supposed to say. We'll check with them before we give their names out.
It's not good.
Hi, Betty.
Hi. Do we know the position of any of the candidates for governor and how they feel?
Do we know the position of any of the candidates for governor and how they might feel about disposition of the property? No. So one more question. Yes.
Kate Eagle, community member. Can you clarify a little bit more about the goal lines for the 60 days? You know, it's a fiscal process, but would it also outline the trust and outline the seed money you mentioned? Is that all part of that process, or would that be a separate process? Can you give us a little bit more of a sense of that? That 60 days is an important goal line for us, right? It buys us time, I think.
Within the 60 days, is it the legislation and the financial setup and everything? Does that all have to be in place?
Or potentially could be, I should say.
So the state budget process obviously is about money, but in this era, a lot of policy gets done through the budget. So this would all be a package that would, I do need to respond to what you were saying though about the cost. Part of this is to buy us time. The state's gonna have some costs of, we've heard 8 to 10 million just to keep it in the warm shutdown phase. So it's the state's liability, maybe I'm sure more than that, right? So there has to be a cost share, there has to be a way that the state will give this process a chance. But yes, it would all, it's a very, very ambitious timeline.
I think we need to actually hold the questions, and we're going to do breakout sessions where the questions, about 30 minutes, and there'll be time for you all to speak among yourselves. We have facilitators. We had arranged to have enough facilitators for about a third of the number of people who actually showed up. So we thought that this might happen, so what we've done is we've created an agenda for the breakout sessions, and we're going to be passing them around now, Steve, so that you will know what to do, and I'll explain a little bit right now. So the goal of this breakout session is to get your feedback about the subjects that we already spoke of. First of all, we're going to ask you among yourselves, and we're going to try to get 8 people at each one of these little tables, so you're going to be turning around and talking to your neighbors. And because of the acoustics in this room, you have to whisper. Otherwise, it will be such a din that no one will be able to hear anybody. So we'd like you to just go around and do introductions, say your name, and 1 or 2 sentences why Eldridge is important to you and what characteristics of Glen Ellen do you want to maintain. So that'll just be the introductions, and if you all could wait before you get up and start talking, I'm going to do this really quickly. Thank you. And then there's a question about the goals and guiding principles. Do you support the goals and guiding principles that were named? And they will be on your table, so you'll know what they are. And is anything missing? Question about the governance models. Do you feel you could support a trust model? And what concepts do you want included in the trust legislation to make sure that your interests are being carried out? And then there's some examples, and then we'll ask you for a vision of the future of Eldridge. What are your ideas for the amount and types of land uses for the site, etc.? And we're going to try to do that all. So each one of those questions is going to get 5 minutes, which doesn't leave a lot of time, but the other thing I want to reassure you is that we're going to be having another one of these meetings. We haven't scheduled it, but we're going to have another one of these meetings soon. So that as more information comes up, we can actually pass it on to you and get your feedback. So we're having a 5-minute break, and I encourage as many of you to stay. and do this breakout session so that we can get your feedback, so we can develop this consensus we need. A couple of housekeeping things. If you haven't signed your name on these boards and given us your contact information, please do so on your way out. And I've had a couple of questions about how we're going to be following up with this. And so one thing I want to do is ask you all if there's anybody, we're not going to have every table report, but I'd like to invite those of you who have 2 or 3 groups, ask their recorder to stand up and give us the salient questions or comments that came from your group. So I think everybody would like to hear a few things from the other groups. So do I have any volunteers? Yes? Which one? Okay. Teresa? Oh, Richard, do we have a speaker?
All right, I'd like to thank Greg Montgomery, our host of our group. We had a very lively discussion, and under number 1 in the 1 or 2 sentences, we came up with 13 points. About the semi-rural characteristics of Glen Ellen. We would like to preserve the natural quality of the space, including the wildlife corridor. People are concerned about the history, and including the history of the healing. Keep something with the medical focus, museum, keep housing to a minimum, and try to repurpose as much as possible. Also, there's some concern in our group about housing for the low-income people and the needy, and to keep the, pardon me? And regular people, housing for everybody. Keep the building footprints, and people are concerned about who will be in charge of the economic development. Under number 2, we do like the guiding principles, and in anything missing, the idea of ecotourism came up. And under number 3, all 9 of us they feel like we can support the trust model. And under B, at least 2, we wanted to make sure that concepts that are included in the trust document, that at least two members of and then we have an awful lot in the next one. Do you want me to go through them?
No, I think maybe just name 1 or 2 so other people can have a chance.
Let's see. Well, I guess probably...
It's something that maybe hasn't been mentioned so far.
Well, people really did not want to have any huge industrial developments or professional sports developments, and I think you all know what we mean. Community activity for families on the campus with the pool and the camp and the gymnasium and the ball fields to have a community center for that kind of orientation. And the last thing, we wanted to make sure the water's protected and no golf courses, and just responsible management of our land. That's it.
Thank you. How about, and by the way, we are going to be taking all of these sheets and collating all of the information. I saw Tracy raise her hand and volunteer. Somebody's going to do that. So when you're done or on the way out, I think you can pass them to Tracy. How about, yes?
Microphone?
Pass the microphone back.
Our little group of 4 decided that we want primarily to preserve and maintain the historic structures. We want to see the open space maintained and promoted for birding and hiking. Yes, we approve of the goals and guiding principles. Yes, we like a trust for a model. We would like to see 50 to 70% of Glen Ellen residents on the ad hoc team for the trust. And our vision for the future of Eldridge, for the financial supports, a satellite campus for one of the universities, maybe in the ag departments, local businesses, recreational facilities. Smaller things, affordable housing, a hostel, something to honor the original people of that place, a museum, library, historic park, and conference center.
Awesome. You're hired. So I spoke with the group right back there. You know who you are. Would you like to stand up and say some of the questions that came out of your discussion? I thought they had some interesting questions.
Okay.
Hold on.
I'm Patty Kaiser. Can you hear me now? Okay, great. So we, on number one, we wanted open land, wildlife corridor, historic value. The property and wildlife habitat corridor are extremely important. Okay, that's 1, 2. We agreed on the goals and guidelines, yes. Missing community representation. What is the economic engine? Why not some tourism to help with economic engine? Let's see, 3, let's see, yes. 3B, trust model. How would members of the board be selected? The trust is a great idea, but there is a big difference between Presidio and Eldridge. There are fewer houses to rent. We have to bring the houses or businesses or tourism. We need to restrict businesses. Who are they?
I think the word is recruit.
Recruit.
That's my
okay,
handwriting.
yes, you are.
I actually ended up taking notes for them.
Thank you.
I should be reading that. The questions are interesting because they really get into the economics of how this could work, and I think that is probably an underground question that's there among all of you, and I think that really does need to be brought up and addressed. That's a big one.
And then for the bid number 4, we were thinking ropes course, serving youth at risk in the community, no additional buildings or almost none, theater, extension of the JC or campus anchor, conference center, as little as possible commercial, conservation core housing, homeless housing, environmental research center, community center, educational, culinary school, rehab buildings for commercial use, no temporary housing, resort question, and then the last one, how to protect the property in the meantime.
Okay, those are all great questions. Does any group have anything really unusual or not yet spoken that they want to add? Yes. Tracy? Oh, okay, so we've got, competing microphones.
Hello. Hi, I'm George. One thing that we came up with is this campus was self-sufficient at one time, and as we move toward net zero energy consumption, we should all keep that in mind moving forward. Because the infrastructure on the campus is almost depleted for its viable use. So we should try to think about ways moving forward to minimize or eliminate our need for our reliability on fossil fuels or any other alternate, other means other than something that's sustainable.
Thank you. We have a second, if not more, a third, a fourth.
So
Yes.
something we discussed that didn't come up here that was fairly intriguing was transferring the wildlands on the west side to Jack London, since they already are doing those things, and Jeff created a viable, Richard's nodding his head because of course he's thought of this and they discussed it, but they're already running a viable economic solution that satisfied the state, so Camp Villa would be a jumping off point for that, to bring that back to its original purpose, which was to serve youth and generate some income in those ways, and just show the state that that something can be managed there, and there could be some fiscal viability. And also on a little more complicated, on the east side of the land that borders the county, I don't know the particulars of this. I'm sitting with a gentleman here who does know more, very involved with Jack London, is to try to get the state to take the east side land and then subcontract to the county to increase the regional park, and then use the trust model for the urban blueprint, because that's a whole other quagmire. And of course, there was some trepidation about the trust, like we all have and should have, in the sense, well, who's on it? And then what happens? But not hearing a better solution, the trust is something to look very hard at. And of course, we wanted, as BJ said, to have a 50% or greater Glen Ellen / Sonoma Valley close by, as I have someone here who lives right across Madrone, people on the trust as far as the ad hoc people went. And then there's several other things, but I'm sure they're repeated in a lot of the other groups, not to monopolize time.
Richard, do you want to address any of those? Because you were thumbs up, and I know.
I just like a lot of suggestions.
Okay. Yeah, there's a couple of you still.
The one thing that one of the people in our group brought up was an emergency center. There is no mega emergency center in Northern California. And one of the things he also suggested, he works at the SDC, was a helipad. And we know from the recent fire, the only public emergency center in Sonoma County is in the Veterans Hall, which holds 200 people. And as we all know, all of us who were evacuated, I slept in the barn at the fairgrounds. There is no emergency center that we could go to. It was a horrible mess. So one of the things that we ought to consider is having an emergency, a Northern California emergency center there.
And I want to make sure you wrote that down, right? Because I'm not taking notes up here. I hope you wrote that down. Okay, yes, Arthur.
So just to expand on a couple of things, yeah, that emergency center sounds
And I'd
great.
like everybody to be really brief, because we're actually going over time.
I'm going to be very brief. So just to expand on a couple of things, the emergency center sounds great, and we thought of having an urgent care facility, because there's nothing between Sonoma and Santa Rosa, so something that could serve Glen Ellen in this area, the northern part of the valley. And then to expand on the tourism, to somehow find a way to integrate community benefits with sustainable tourism, low-impact tourism. So maybe having a parking area where people could then rent a bicycle and bike into downtown Glen Ellen via the bike trail, things like that. And that's basically it. And we also want to have Glen Ellen people on the board.
Okay, just a second, and all the way in the back there.
So we echo greatly what the gentleman in the front said regarding creating a model community that is forward-looking, addressing things like sustainability around water, energy, all sorts of stuff like that, transportation. And the big difference was not letting the land just sit there and exist as it is. We have so many beautiful open spaces. We get that, but let's make that something really great and part of the community and helpful and forward-looking, instead of a bunch of like buildings that may or may not be used, and be mindful about how we grow it. And I just love the idea of, what if Glen Ellen was like model community for everybody around us to see what sustainability looks like going forward and in a respectful manner for the land around it. We were worried or concerned that we're unsure how the trust members get put into place. So to BJ's point about wanting like 50% or more people on it, it's ad hoc, and there's nothing like really clearly saying, how do we ensure? And it was also brought up that there is no way to ensure that we are those people on that board. And that makes me nervous, because if they're politically appointed people, it kind of goes with whoever's in office. And that
Okay, one more question. Yes.
Forget about,
It's coming, it's coming.
You go, Jerry.
Two.
Well, they asked about things that were.
To your mouth.
Yeah. If you, I'll just say one thing. We need to know who these great minds are who are working on this. That should be public information.
Yes,
Okay, last question, that was great. Did somebody break that down?
Just to add to a couple of things that I didn't hear said that we felt were important is we felt there should be more definition around the financial viability goals that we have. What are they? And I think they should be more than a net zero.
Thank you. And I noticed that people are starting to creep out. So okay, I said last one, this is the last one. The last one.
Hi. I just wanted to throw this out as a part of the financial viability potential. I know that at Presidio, one of the big pockets that came in was Lucasfilms, and they added a campus there. And I know that this region is a hot place for the film industry. People like to come here to film because it's beautiful. And I could see that as a potential way to bring in some deep pockets in order to subsidize other uses for the space.
Okay, perfect. You guys have all been incredibly fruitful and eloquent, and I thank you for your... But before we leave, I just want to say, and Tracy or Vicki, if I'm misspeaking, please tell me, we are going to take this information, as I said, and we're going to collate it. Well, we're also talking about that we've been filming, so those of you who didn't go, if you know people who weren't able to come, please tell them that we're going to have the film of it up on a website so that they'll be able to see the discussion. And we're also talking about doing a survey monkey so that we get these questions out to as many people as possible so we get back as much feedback as possible. And there's one last thing I wanted to say that people have been pointing out to me that there is a handout that's been going around. If you all are curious about what some of the other proposals are for the property, the lady at the door has something to give you. It's not something that we're promoting, but it's something that isn't a possible option about having a horse facility there. We asked that she give the information out on the way out rather than during the meeting. And thank you all for being here.